Humanity is a crop producing some sort of substance called Loosh that demons in the sky suck out of us for sustenance. That was essentially how it was left after Robert Monroe's first book, Journeys Out of the Body. Kind of wish he'd never left his body to begin with. But is that the whole story? Yes, it is. And no. There's so much more to it.
Welcome to the Woo There It Is podcast.
So in the last episode, I talked about how Robert Monroe, a wealthy radio executive, started spontaneously coming out of his body and everything that happened after that. I basically left it on a dark note about Loosh. That's where Robert Monroe was left as well after that book. That was the end of the book, essentially. But he had a lot more to learn, and even he didn't know it. This came out later on. He wrote Far Journeys. At the beginning of this book, he talks about how he still doesn't really know how or why he was able to come out of his body. But he says that he and a friend were driving to the house that he lived in when he started coming out of his body initially. And his friend took one look at the house and was like, "Oh, I know why you started coming out of your body." And he's like, "Why?" He says, "Oh, because it's a pyramid-shaped roof, and it's made out of copper." And his friend told him, yeah, all of the Egyptian pyramids, they were built out of copper originally, but all of the copper was stolen by thieves over the years, is what he says. I don't know if that's true. Obviously, Monroe doesn't either, but it's interesting to think about. And one night, he comes out of body on a regular basis, and I mentioned this before, he would get this really strong sex urge. He had kind of taught himself to just like, okay, cool it, you can just do that later, but right now you want to go exploring. All of a sudden, before he even had time to cool it off, he found himself in front of this huge structure. He did not know what he was looking at first, but it was as high as he could see and then as wide as he could see. So it was gigantic. He was like, what am I seeing here? And it was like all this wriggling and just kind of gross sounding squelchy noises. And he was like, what am I seeing here? And he looked closer, and you probably already guessed. This was a huge pile of naked people trying to go at it. And he sensed that they were all dead. They had died, and they had never really dealt properly with the sex urge. And so they were completely ruled by it. And there were places in the astral for everybody who was ruled by some sort of urge that they never really mastered as human beings. And I'm like, fuck, I'm going to be eating donuts forever. I just know it. I'm going to be in the donut pile. But it was so disgusting. And he was like, these people, they've got to get out of this. This is nasty. And he found some guy's leg, his foot, and he just kind of pulled the guy out of the sex pile. And he was like, hey, buddy, get out of it. Snap out of it. And the guy just hungrily just went back to the sex pile to start getting it on again. He was completely out of his mind. And this was so disturbing to Monroe that after that, all he had to do was think about the sex pile, and he was never dominated by that urge again. It was not a problem for him. But Monroe spends so much time out of body every single night. After a while, he literally gets bored. And he stops going out of his body. He just returns to his body and just reads a book at night. But then he gets the idea to go out of his body and then let his higher self take over. And it turns out that was a very good idea. So when he goes out of body, he starts to pick up on the signature of this guiding entity, and he starts going straight towards it. All of a sudden, he hits this barrier. And it's this barrier of very bright light. It forms into this humanoid shape, and it's radiating so much that Monroe starts to boil. This entity that he ran up into kind of tones it down a little bit for him. And the entity that he runs into which he starts to refer to it as the intelligent species, but then he calls it INSPEC for short. So I'm going to call it that, INSPEC. So this INSPEC basically tells him, yeah, buddy, you just hit a portal that you don't have access to. That's why you were boiling. And so he starts to ask them questions, but even before he starts asking, they're answering because they have full access to all of his thoughts. And I have to take a step back and point out that Robert Monroe, after his first book, he developed an entire institute, the Monroe Institute, dedicated to studying out-of-body experiences, as well as how to induce them. And he has a whole series of tapes called the Gateway Tapes. I own them. I've been listening to some of them. And he's got a group of people that he calls the explorers, and they're really good at getting out of body and going around and meeting different intelligences, entities out there. And that's an entirely different podcast topic I didn't want to get into. But he's been doing that research. And so his first question for the INSPEC that he runs into is, are you the entity that my explorers have been communicating with? And his INSPEC says, in some instances, but not all. And Monroe asks them, are you God? And they said, we are created and we create just as you. If God and creator are identical, then you are God to that which you create. I feel like he could have just said no, but whatever. And he asks them some more questions. He finds out that they are basically here to help things sort of flow on Earth. And they tell him, you will learn of the basic or original design. And he's endlessly curious. He wants to know. I don't even care. Like, that's what's wrong with me that I'm like, But he really wants to know. And they're like, hold up, slow down. You need to kind of walk before you can fly. And he's like, why did you bring me out of my body? That was definitely flying before I had any access to walking. They say to him, the reason he was kind of pulled out of his body and sort of made to fly really quickly was because they said you had a latent capability to perform an important function of a very minor nature at this point in the development of human consciousness. And it kind of seems like they're saying, because you were going to create the Monroe Institute in the Gateway process, kind of seems like that. He thinks that the reason he was selected for this was because he's so endlessly curious. But they tell him that knowing any more about his function at this juncture will just mess him up. So he has to kind of wait. And so he starts taking lessons. He starts kind of going through all of these simulations where he has to make different choices. And he goes through a lot of what they were, but I'm not that interested. They weren't that interesting. But one of them was interesting. And it relates to a vision that he saw in the previous book, which I mentioned in the last episode. And this is the one where he was standing over the 13-year-old girl. He says that he's taken essentially back to that same simulation. And he is a priest. He's holding up a knife, and his job is to stab this 13-year-old girl. And there's a fat priest. I don't know why he had to be fat, but there's a fat priest that's standing over him, telling him what he has to do, that he has to do this. And Monroe says that he looks into this kid's eyes, and he can just see this sort of helplessness, this pleading, and confused and scared. He's just like, fuck it. And he throws the knife on the ground. And he says, I am free, as he's throwing the knife down. And everything just in the vision just kind of blows up or kind of warps and just vanishes into like a big ball of light. And he's filled with this very powerful emotion from that decision that he made. And his INSPEC tells him that that emotion he feels is a, quote, specific observable result of exposure to the Loosh/love radiation. Loosh and love in the same sentence? That's weird. What does that mean? Well, we'll find out. So this is sort of his habit. Every night he'll go out of body, meet with his INSPEC friends, take some sort of lesson or learn something new, rinse, wash, and repeat. One night he jumps out of body is flying towards his INSPEC friends. And as he's passing through the inner band that surrounds the Earth, and I'm going to talk about that inner band in a second, but as he's passing through that inner band, he gets stopped by an entity there. And that's not really usual for him to get stopped. And the entity is like, hey, oh, it's not you. And Monroe tries to go back to the signal that his INSPEC friends were emitting, but it's gone. And so he thinks, well, maybe I'm supposed to meet with this guy, whoever he is. And so he turns back around to the guy. He says, so what do you want? And the gentleman said, if you're human, you can't help because you're addicted like all the rest. That's interesting. We are kind of addicted. And Monroe's like, well, why don't you try me? And he could tell that this being is very lonely. And the being's like, okay, fine. And he essentially sends what Monroe calls a rote, R-O-T-E. And basically that's a download. I'm not going to get too far into it, but it's essentially a download. So it's like a packet of information that Monroe becomes privy to once it gets sent to him. And here's the story of what this entity had gone through before he met with Monroe. So I'm going to call the entity Barry. Barry and his friend Andy were from some other star system. This kind of sounds ridiculous, but I think this is actually a thing. So they're two entities, and they're not human. They're something else outside of space and time, remember. And they're from some other star system, and he calls it KT-95. And they were basically on some sort of intergalactic cruise ship that was taking them to other planets, other realities, to just kind of explore what it's like in other parts of the universe. And it's kind of funny. There was an episode of Doctor Who where a bunch of different types of entities, aliens basically, were traveling around on an intergalactic spaceship. It's kind of interesting. It feels like this is kind of similar to that. And just like on any cruise ship, it would have excursions where you would stop at, like, I don't know, Mars and just see what Mars is like. But when they get near to Earth, they call Earth, this excursion, the Earth excursion, the time-space illusion. Because that's what Earth is. We're all kind of trapped in time-space. This is illusion that we live in time and space. Which is crazy to think that is an illusion. And so they decided to check it out. And they kind of get taken to something that's close to New York City. So they're kind of aware of all of the sort of loudness. And as non-human entities, they're just very aware of how loud and cacophonous and insane it all is. Because it's all these people's uncontrollable thoughts, and that creates this energy that they get exposed to. And it's very raucous and disturbing to entities who are not used to that. And when I spoke about the band of energy that exists around the Earth, this initial band that was sort of closer to Earth would be very thick and dense and cacophonous, and very loud and full of anger and fear and just the thoughts of every dead thing and people who are on drugs and just people who are asleep. Everything is in the closest band to the Earth. And then it gets lighter, less dense as you get further away from the Earth. And so they're kind of experiencing, Andy and Barry are experiencing this really loud band. And Barry immediately just kind of backs out of it, and he goes back to the sort of way station. There's a way station outside of Earth that people who are checking it out park at for a moment. And he's like, wow, I want nothing to do with that. That's crazy. But Andy kind of sticks his hand in. He doesn't have a hand, but whatever an analogy to that might be for this entity. And he's just amazed at the power. So yeah, it's loud and cacophonous, but he's like, it's so much power. What is that? It's so amazing. He's just like very intrigued by it. And he says there's sort of an attendant there. He says, can I kind of go in closer and see, how do I kind of experience the, time-space illusion? And the attendant says, oh yeah, you just go over there, but you probably don't want to do it because it's not that great. It's actually pretty terrible. Andy's like, you're just fear mongering. And the attendant is like, I don't know. I don't recommend that you do it. But Andy says this, I don't know how to express it. It seems very important that I try it. And then Andy kind of goes down into the Earth time-space illusion to experience it. So Barry's sitting back waiting, and then he keeps waiting and waiting, and Andy doesn't come back. And Barry says, hey, what's going on with Andy, to the attendant? And the attendant's like, I was kind of worried that this might happen. Yeah, Barry, I think your friend might be a repeater. Someone who wants to go through the Earth experience again. And Barry's like, hell no. And he goes down into the cacophony to pull Andy back out. And he finds him immediately. And Andy's kind of in the outer bands. And Barry pulls him out. And Andy doesn't recognize him at first. And Barry's like, hey, so what was it like? What was it like in the Earth time-space illusion? And Andy's like, it was astounding. There are no words to describe it. He doesn't know how to explain what he's just been through. It kind of reminds me of human beings who leave the time-space illusion through near-death experiences and how they can't describe most of what they experience because you're not even in the same physical reality. And Barry's like, okay, well, cool. Let's go back to KT95. Come on, Andy. And Andy's like, no way. I was just a man, but I haven't experienced what it's like to be a woman. I got to go try it again. And he goes right back in. And Barry's like, dude, you're getting hooked, but it doesn't matter. Andy is hooked. And so he goes right back down into the mire. And when Barry gets back to the entry attendant is like, dude, I'm so sorry. Barry's like, well, what happens to him now? And the attendant says, well, if he follows the pattern, he will get more and more involved in the human experience, dropping down a ring each time. So going from the outer bands where it's less noisy to the inner bands around the Earth until he's at the bottom. And then most people stay at the bottom and they don't come back, or they can begin working their way back up. But either way, it's going to be a while. So go back to KT95. That's what he tells Barry. So Barry's just kind of depressed and lonely, and he just drifts away. And then he sees Andy, and he's like, hey, buddy. And he grabs onto him, but it's not Andy. It was Monroe. And we're back to that part of the story. And before Monroe can really say much more to Barry, he actually has to go back to his body. And the next time he's out of body, he gets back to his INSPEC friend. And they tell Monroe, hey, we want you to help Barry basically find his friend or get his friend back. And Monroe's like, I think that's a pretty tall order because Andy was addicted, but he'll do whatever they suggest. And they also give him a message to share with Barry the next time he sees him to kind of help with Barry's understanding. And the message does kind of help Barry integrate some information about what it's like to be a human, but really you have to be a human being to understand what it's like to be a human. And Barry is like, hell no, because human beings are fucked up. And I don't blame him. He's kind of right. So Barry is ready to go back into the rings and pull Andy out, and Monroe goes with him. But Monroe is not nearly as optimistic as Barry is because he kind of knows what's going to happen. At this time, Andy, of course, is not in any of the outer rings. He's much further in, which is a bad sign. It means that he's more addicted to the human thing. And then finally, Barry finds Andy, and he darts towards him, but then he stops short. He's like, it's Andy, but it's different. Like, he's already starting to not even recognize who Andy is. And Andy's kind of this old woman. Apparently, she's just died. And Barry comes up to Andy as an old woman and says hi. And Andy kind of recognizes him. But when Barry says, hey, we need to go home, Andy's like, no. And he starts talking about, well, I was just in this life and this happened. He starts recounting all of the details of this life, that he was just this illusioned life that he was just living. And he says, I want to go back and be a strong warrior and see what see what happens then. And then Andy just dives right back into the mire. And so Barry and Monroe follow Andy once again. And this time he's a soldier kind of in ancient Roman times, and he's marching to battle. And Monroe watches as he gets ambushed and speared in the back. Like immediately he's dead. And Barry goes down and pulls him out of his body. But Andy doesn't even know Barry's there. He doesn't even acknowledge him. He's so lost in this story that he goes back down and he's trying to pick up weapons, but he can't because he's just a soul now. He doesn't realize that he's dead, and there's no communicating with him. He's so lost in it. So Barry and Monroe kind of have to give up. And Monroe has to leave Barry there because the blankets have fallen off of his body and he's cold. So a few weeks later, Monroe gets out of his body again. He once again runs into Barry, and he can tell Barry is just desperately lonely. He's lost his best friend, his only friend, really. And Barry's just kind of listless, and they chit-chat a little bit, but they don't really have much to say. And then Barry remembers, oh yeah, there was like a brochure that they gave. It was sort of, again, this is outside of time and space. There was a brochure that they gave us that told us a little bit about the Earth time-space illusion. And he throws Monroe like a download about what that brochure, whenever Barry and Andy were flying through space on their intergalactic travel cruise ship. And so Monroe takes the road, and we find out more than we wanted to know about the origins of the Earth time-space illusion. So Monroe becomes familiar with someone, perhaps an entity. It's hard to come up with a noun that describes this being, that needed to hunt for a specific source of fuel. And this entity would have to kind of hunt around for it. But then it came up with the idea of just creating a garden. And the garden would sort of create the fuel. The things in the garden would create the fuel for the entity, and the entity could just draw the fuel from this garden. And at first, when its first crop in the garden didn't really go that well, but it got better and better at creating crops that would grow on the garden that the entity and his buddies could draw the fuel from. But they kind of had to refine the fuel, which was okay. It was like kind of a pain, but they would have to refine the fuel in order for them to be able to use the fuel as their energy source. But one day from the garden, there were these streams of perfect fuel that were coming out that were perfectly refined and beautiful. The entities were like, what was that? And so, as you might have guessed, I don't know how obvious this was or how not obvious, but the garden that the entity created was Earth. And the crops were all of the living things on Earth, with the predominant source of the fuel being human beings. And the fuel is Loosh. And when the entities sensed this very refined source of Loosh that didn't need any more refining, it was just a perfect pure stream of it. It was in a couple of circumstances for these human beings. One of them was when the human being was protecting their young. And the other instance was when a human being was feeling particularly lonely. So there you have it. Earth was created, according to this information that Monroe came across, Earth was created as a garden, and humans are just a crop to create Loosh for some other entity. And Loosh is created when we feel really powerful emotions. And when I read that, I was like, aha, that is why the INSPEC wanted Monroe to help Barry out, so that Barry would ultimately convey this pretty harrowing information to Monroe. I was wrong.